Hello, hello. I am here with Sean. Very excited to chat with Sean today on the 99 Dev Problem Show. Sean, I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
Hey everyone, hey, it's great to see you again. My name is Sean Falconer, and I am currently the AI entrepreneur in residence at a company called Confluent, which is famous for uh, essentially the Kafka open source project. Jay Kreps, CEO and founder, and the rest of the founders created that project and then spun that off into Confluent, which is now a publicly traded company for the last 3 years and has about, I think, 3,500 employees. So good size, it's a good size company. And I recently joined just a couple months ago.
Ooh. Well, I love your title. Say your title again.
AI entrepreneur in residence.
I love that. You said it very quickly, which is fine, but I think it's a really interesting title. And so I'd love to like kind of unpack that a little bit. Like, what do you do over at Confluent?
Yeah, this is a big question, right? I get that pretty much every day, even for people inside Confluent. They're like, what are you doing here? Everybody's excited
Love that.
about you being here, but what is it that you do? So, I mean, really, it's so if you think about if you're familiar with the concept of an entrepreneur in residence, usually you see those roles within like venture capital firms where they bring in somebody that has certain background expertise. Maybe they've been a founder in the past, and they're there for a while to sort of like spend some time. They get some resources and they're sort of incubating and trying to figure out like what is their next business that they want to launch in a particular space. And at the same time, they're also serving as like a subject matter expert and offering some mentoring to existing part of the portfolio. And in a similar spirit within larger companies, sometimes larger companies will also have these EIR roles. But there, it's less about necessarily spinning off like a new business that I'm going to be, the CEO of, and it's going to be a separate entity from Confluent. But how do you essentially create sort of like an innovation arm within a company where they can drive to trying to create like either a new type of product or a new business unit centered around like whatever your area expertise is. And then for me in particular with this role of AI entrepreneur in residence, I did a master's and PhD and postdoc years ago in computer science. My background there was in machine learning and also applied machine learning across a bunch of different domains. And so it's kind of dipping into my background and expertise there. I've worked in industry applying machine learning as well. I was an entrepreneur at some point. So it's combining a lot of these different skill sets, but primarily focused on from a technology strategy point of view, like how do we drive Confluent as a AI thought leader? How do we align our product offering with other parts of the business unit to start to essentially generate revenue and solve problems for customers.
Yeah, I love that. That's really cool. I definitely want to unpack a little bit more of that because there's some really awesome stuff I'm sure you're doing over there. You alluded to it, but one of the first questions I like to ask is what's your developer education? So you did share some of it, but if you want to, kind of share all of that, we'd love to hear what your formal education is.
Yeah, sure. So I spent a lot of time in school, and but I started sort of engineering maybe when I was like 14 or 15 in high school when I
Love
first
that.
really fell in love with computers. And I was fortunate to go to high school at the time where sort of the home PC era and the internet was first sort of being introduced in mass to people. So that really like, I just became obsessed essentially. Like I grew up in a really small rural community in Canada. So suddenly to be able to like learn anything that I wanted or talk to people all over the world really just was super fascinating to me. And I would get up at like 4:35 a.m. in the morning before school because back then you had dial-up internet and you had free internet from like 12 to 8 a.m. So we get up at like 4:35 a.m. before school to get like 3.5 hours of free internet before school started, and like work on websites. And I started looking at websites, and then that kind of gets you into basics of HTML. And then it's like, well, I want to make this website do something. And then it's like, that's kind of the gateway to like JavaScript or something. And then, older backend technologies like Perl to write scripts. And then I started learning like, BASIC and Java and all this sort of stuff. So that was sort of the entry point. And then I went on to study computer science for my undergrad, focused on theory and computation with a minor in math, so very math heavy. And then I did a master's degree, again, like focused in sort of pattern recognition, machine learning, and then a PhD after that. working on sort of applied machine learning using machine learning in combination with human in the loop expertise to solve sort of hard data problems. And
Mm.
then moved from Canada to the US after that to do a postdoc in bioinformatics. And then while I was doing that postdoc, I also started a company, which is where I ended up leaving the world of academics into industry. But the entire time I was in school, I also worked on the side as an engineer, software engineer for a
Mhm.
variety of companies. And part of that was because it was a way for me to pay for my education, but
Sure.
also I was always worried that at some point I might want to go back into industry. And I saw a lot of people who focused on more research and academics kind of de-skill their ability to write code. And I was always nervous
Mm.
about that might maybe happening. Like I knew a lot of professors, brilliant people that couldn't write, like a basic hello world program because they'd just been too far away from it for a long time. And
Mhm.
so I was always nervous about this. So I always wanted to keep up my programming skills so I would
Sure.
have that just in case I needed it. So I spent probably combined through all my education, like I ended up accumulating like probably 6, 7 years of actual like engineering work during that time as well,
Wow.
beyond just what I was doing academically. And then I started a company where I was the CTO and founder of that company, ran it for 7 years. And then after that, I joined Google in engineering. And then when I left Google, I was leading a team in engineering and product. And then I joined a company called Skyflow, which is on the sort of data privacy space. And that was probably my biggest like departure from sort of day-to-day engineering work. I ended up leading the marketing team there. I can go into details of like how that happened. I was like I kind of I don't know, accidentally became the CMO of the company. And then spent 3 years there, and then now more recently joined Confluent to kind of go back onto the technology side of the business.
Oh my gosh, I love that. Okay, I think we need to hear the story of how you accidentally became a CMO. I think I can very much relate to probably how this story goes.
Well, so I originally joined Skyflow's head of developer relations, kind
Mhm.
of to do similar stuff that I did at Google, more focused on like developer experience and improving like our APIs, SDKs, engineering documentation, so on.
Yep.
And then about partway, halfway through my first year, the um, the original CMO of the company didn't work out, and there was a lot of challenges with the marketing team that he had built. So the CEO came to me and said, like, "Hey, I want you to like step in and take over marketing on an interim basis and figure out what's going on here and come up with a plan to try to fix it." And the reason he had done that is because he had been an investor in the company I had started, years ago. And I did a
Mm.
lot of go-to-market stuff there because as a founder, you just end up being thrust into things that maybe you had absolutely no business being thrust into, but there's just nobody else to do that. So, I had tons of engineering training and skills. I didn't know anything about like the business side of the business. I just had to learn that stuff. So I got sort of my MBA the hard way, and
Yep.
also like whatever sort of marketing chops I had, I got the hard way as well through a lot of experimentation and making mistakes. And so I ended up jumping in on the marketing team and taking the lead there. And through the first 6 months, I rebuilt most of the team, and we fixed a lot of sort of fundamental problems. And a lot of it comes down to, I think, just like having a first principles mindset of like, and asking questions, not being afraid of asking like, quote unquote dumb questions, right? And I
Sure.
think some advantage of being sort of a non-traditional marketer there is that I have a fresh set of eyes. I'm not coming in with a playbook that I've done 10 times. I'm just like, does this make sense or not make sense? And we
Yep.
sold to CTOs. So I had been a CTO previously, so I could, sort of figure out whether things made sense to me. Does it pass the smell test? Does this feel authentic? Is the messaging like to marketing? All these types of things. So there were some advantages there. And, you know, so after 6 months, reflecting on where we come, we had like 5x our pipeline. We cut costs by 50%. And we were operating, significantly more efficiently. And I became, I guess, like somewhat a victim of my, our own success with that, where something that originally was more of an interim role became more of a permanent role. But I was always clear to the company that I had no desire to be like a career CMO. I like
Yep.
solving problems, but I felt like we had kind of solved a lot of the fundamental problems. I continued to operate in that capacity for another year or so
Yep.
before I made the transition to going back into more of a technology leadership role.
Oh my gosh, I love everything that you just shared because it's like everything that I do in my day-to-day business today is like talking with technical founders and they're like, I'm doing things I should not be doing. And it's usually marketing, right? And I think something that you shed light on there too is like reducing costs, right? I think that a lot of the marketing, traditional marketing playbooks have a huge investment in sort of ad spend and these other types of big convoluted, expensive things that don't necessarily drive the results that companies actually need. So that I think it's really cool and lucky for them that you fell into that role because it sounds like you really created something absolutely beautiful over there in the marketing department.
Well, I had been because when I had to do marketing at my company, like we were never very well resourced. And by the time I was really
Yeah.
driving go to market, we were like really under resourced. So we were like,
Mhm.
crawling on our bellies through the dirt for years, trying to do everything on like a shoestring budget. So
That's
we had
hard.
to really figure out and be scrappy on what our investments were and always be asking ourselves like is this the best way we can spend this money? If it's
Mhm.
$10,000, what are the other ways we could spend $10,000? Do we think that that might deliver a higher ROI or not? You have to be always sort of asking yourself these things. And the good thing about sort of being starved for resources is it does create sort of this discipline around
Mhm.
does a dollar out equal, a dollar in or more, right? And you have
Yep.
to really be evaluating things like that. And I think one of the challenges that companies sometimes go through is when they're in these high growth phases where the market's really good, getting money is really easy or relatively easy, then
Mhm.
it's sort of a growth at all costs, and you lose sight of, hey, like of that discipline of does this make sense? Does this just is this smart growth or is this like inefficient growth essentially? And
Yep.
you basically build up habits as a business of spending money rather than essentially like making money.
Yes. Yes, I agree. Um, we just had a good little I'm just reading, we had a question come in, but um I agree with that, honestly. And I think a lot of founders are feeling that, especially right now, because the VC space is very different right now. If you're going after AI, here you go, here's your check. But if that's
Here's your
not a
$600 million seed round.
exactly. If you're not in that space though, it's like, where's your revenue, right? They want to see revenue these days. And it's really difficult to do that, especially in that earlier stage. I'm really curious if you're open to it. What business did you have? Like, if you're willing to share, what did
Oh
y'all
yeah,
build and
sure,
what are you doing?
sure. We were always interested in building sort of technology for like an underserved part of the job market.
Mhm.
Originally, like if you think about people who are like college educated, work in technology, we have a ton of tools built for us, whether you're on the hiring side or you're on the side of a candidate. LinkedIn, tons of applicant tracking systems. There's a multi-billion-dollar industry built around this. But
Yeah.
if you work as like a tradesperson or you work in restaurants, whatever it is, there's a lot less technology built for you, both on the hiring side and also on the job seeker side. Like really back when we were doing it, like on the job seeker side, like your best option was Craigslist
Yep.
um, or if you worked in blue collar, there's staffing agencies that you could work with that would temporarily place you different places. So
Yep.
originally we were focused on blue collar temp labor, and that's what we originally raised while I was still doing my postdoc. We raised close to $2 million to start that business, and
Wow.
that's what I left academics to do that full time. And then
Mm.
we
Okay.
kind of pivoted a number of times. There's kind of a long story of all the things that we screwed up along the way. And but eventually we settled on sort of this two-sided marketplace focused primarily on high turnover positions like restaurants, hospitality, and so forth.
Mhm.
And we were really early investors in mobile. And the original versions of the product, it was all like text messaging. We were probably one of the first like customers of Twilio. And
Wow.
we built these sort of fairly simple, you could call them maybe AI, but like bots that would allow you to place somebody at a job. You could broadcast out a job to a bunch of different people that had skill matches and so forth, and you could coordinate everything over cell phones. Because back then, like people didn't a lot of, especially in blue collar, they didn't have the latest iPhone because they were too expensive, but they all
Yep.
had feature phones, so you could do stuff over text. Eventually, as Android and iPhones became more common, then and we went into more the restaurant industry. Like all those people in their early 20s in places like San Francisco, New York, something, they're all like getting jobs on their phones. They're just doing it in like super convoluted ways. So we were the first company to ever build a full end-to-end hiring experience, both from a candidate and hiring standpoint on a mobile device. And then we got
Mhm.
featured by Apple and Google at the time, and grew a lot in terms of our mobile application.
Yeah. Wow, that's really cool. I'm actually pretty sad that that didn't come to fruition further, and I think that, and maybe it did, but it sort of things evolved, right?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't. I think we created a lot of innovative technology at that time, and I think that was like where our strength was. And in
Mhm.
retrospect, looking at things in hindsight, we should have probably leaned more into our strength of like being a technology innovator in the sort of job space, and became maybe more of a tools company of like selling that software as like a SaaS offering, or even like a on-prem installation or something like that,
Yeah.
to existing staffing and hiring companies, because we kind of sucked at that side of the business, to be honest. Like, we were very good at like taking this problem space and applying technology to it in a way that no one had ever done it before.
Yeah.
But some of the business side of just like staffing, we just didn't have the domain expertise, and we didn't have the resources to always hire those people. So that was really like a gap in the company.
That's interesting. I actually came from hospitality management before I got into tech and was actually in restaurant management. So I know very, very, very closely the exact audience and type of roles and sort of humans playing those roles that you're talking about. And um, you know, who knows exactly? I don't know where the timing aligns, but may have been one of those potential users. If that aligns, I don't think it did. But either way, I think that's really interesting because it is sort of a difficult space, and it was. And it was funny because you said Craigslist, and I remember like when I first taught myself how to code and I got out of hospitality management, that's where I found all my freelance clients was on Craigslist because like it was great.
Yeah.
Craigslist is not what it used to be today.
Yeah, I mean, it still like has huge. I mean, it's been a while since I've been, on Craigslist. There was a time where I probably knew more about Craigslist than any human alive, besides maybe Craig, who created
Craig.
it. But like the once you get, the thing about like marketplaces is, once you have network effects, it's really really difficult to displace something as network effects. So
Yeah.
the entire valley is like littered with the bodies of companies that have attempted to take on Craigslist, especially in their core places where they make money, like hotel rentals, and as well as jobs, because
Yep.
jobs is really where they make the majority of their money. And a lot of people don't even know that they charge for jobs, but they do. And back when we were doing it, the most expensive place in US was the Bay Area, where it was like $75 to post a job. But if you compared that to almost any other sort of equivalent job board, that was a fraction of the cost.
Mhm.
Even though it's this kind of disaster experience for people, it's like, I know I can put my money in, and I'm going to get like 100 applications for my hostess position or my host position. And
Yep.
for people who are working where they have roles that are over 100% turnover rate, and you're paying minimum wage, you just can't afford to pay $500 to place that person,
Yep.
or pay a recruiter to go and source this person. It's just not a reasonable thing to do. So it's
Mhm.
very very it's all about like cost efficiencies, essentially. And most of these people are non-professional hires, so they're kind of okay using something like email to manage that process.
Yep, yep, I agree. All right, so Jay has a question that he asked in the chat, and I think sort of as we get into the interview, which we've already, been able to chat about a number of things, but addressing Jay's question, with your broad experience in technology, do you believe that IT services are ending as some warn that AI is taking over? We chatted about this
Yeah,
pre-show, so I'm excited.
this of course is like a huge topic of conversation of like, is
Yes.
AI taking our jobs? And actually, I remember about a year and a half ago, I had traveled to visit my parents in rural Canada. My dad picked me up in like Maine, where I was flying into, and the first thing he asked me is like, "Is AI going to take people's jobs?" And I was like,
That's
"Wow,
funny.
if this is on sort of the topic of conversation amongst the retirement community of people in their mid 70s in rural Canada, this is really like a hot topic of conversation right now."
For
But
sure.
I mean, so a couple things. One thing is that I think if you look at the history of technology, even going back to things like printing press, like every big shift that's happened in technology, people have gotten scared of the idea of like losing jobs. Yet,
Mhm.
if you look at the trends, every new technology shift has actually led to many, many more jobs than previously. And it's hard to point to a situation where a device or some sort of technology innovation actually led to less jobs.
Yep.
or even the full elimination of a tier of job. But that doesn't mean that there isn't some, sort of collateral damage that can happen during those swings, where there can be jobs that become sort of less relevant, or they require less people than previously, and there's suddenly like a new branch of jobs that you have to skill up for. So there can be certainly shifts that happen where people unfortunately get do lose their jobs, or what they do today, and they might have to figure out how to like reskill before you get sort of the next generation of job seekers that maybe are no longer training as a, I don't know, a blacksmith and a cobbler, but are going and training as something else. So
Yeah.
I do think that can happen. Now, in terms of like today, is AI taking over? I don't believe that for the most part, most AI technology is in a place where it could really replace somebody today. Especially on sort of engineering, IT side, like there's things where I think you can do a lot more with a single individual than maybe you could previously. And if you look at things like coding assistant tools, like there's plenty of statistics to show that people are significantly more productive using some of those tools. They're closing out more bugs, they're generating more PRs, all those types of things. And you can take somebody who's maybe a little bit more junior and upskill them a little bit faster using
Yep.
some of these others. But there is a ceiling to it. Essentially, at some point, you need to like have those skills. But even if you're able to do more, like let's say one person becomes suddenly 5x that person, I think all you end up doing is you end up creating 5x more companies, because that suddenly you can run a lot more efficiently, and the cost of essentially starting a business is lower because now I can do it for less cost. Then you're gonna end up with more people essentially innovating and having and becoming entrepreneurs. So you see the same thing that has happened, like the with public cloud, that led to huge birth of new companies, because suddenly I don't need to spend 2 years investment in like real infrastructure racking and stacking servers. I can just like literally click a button and have an EC2 instance running on AWS, and can get up and running. And now there's even with iPaaS and stuff like that, like really like low, basically just commit something to GitHub, and suddenly I have an amazing scalable web front end. So
Mhm.
for the most part, my perspective on this is that I think the idea that AI is taking over and going to replace people's jobs is sort of premature thinking. Like I don't think we're at that stage, and I think that for the most part, it's going to actually generate a lot more jobs than in reality in the long run.
Yeah. There were so many things that you said that I think to just kind of pull on a little bit. And I think you're definitely right about like more businesses being able to be created and sort of more efficiency. For anyone who's might be listening, if you are curious, and for Jay who's in the chat, there's actually a recording on YouTube that we did on Monday. We didn't get to dig into as much of like how exactly folks are utilizing AI, but we had a really good conversation about is AI going to take jobs? And a lot of bits and pieces that came out of that was really like it's making all of us better. And in my business, like there's a lot of things that I've been able to do and start to optimize and start to streamline that I never could have done before with some of the tools that now exist, like Claude, right? I've got certain prompts, or ChatGPT has gotten better lately, that I'll prompt against it. And it's things that I would have needed an assistant for, or things that I would have needed to bring someone in. And so I do agree that I think it's a beautiful supplement. I think one of the biggest comments that came out of that panel is someone said that he's like, I don't have to do the stuff I don't want to do anymore. And I think that's the beautiful part of sort of the IT software engineering, some of that. It's like we can use these great skills that we have, that we've learned throughout the years, right? To actually start to improve our day to day and offload the things we don't want to do, and actually use sort of that human, that problem solving brain that we all have, to actually do the things that humans need to be doing.
Yeah. And I want to address a follow up too from the person that asked a question where they said, even basic apps can be developed by AI. So I
Yeah.
think that, so if you think about like some of the, like, I don't know, like business or consumer facing applications that exist that are some of the most high value apps in the world, like, I think like you could go, let's say you, even without AI, you had a team of engineers and you went and cloned that application. I think the idea that simply creating a copy of that application suddenly gives you the same value as the existing application is a sort of a misinterpretation of where the value of that business
Hmm.
is. So,
Hmm.
like things like Atlassian, Salesforce, Twitter, like you could essentially say that all those companies are the front end of a database. They have a database and they're just reskinning it in the front end of another database. So would it be that hard to like create a similar experience? Like I can, go and create a version of Twitter, like especially the first version of Twitter was very, very simple. It's like you text
Mhm.
something and it shows up online. Like that's not that hard an application. Anybody could build that. And but the value of those businesses has very little in some ways to do with the actual sort of front end consumer application experience. If something like Twitter, the value of any social network is essentially the fact that there's people there. That's like the
Yep.
hard problem to solve. So they solved that problem. So I can go and clone Twitter, but that doesn't make me Twitter. And I could go clone Salesforce as well. And a ton of people have tried to take on Salesforce as new, better versions of a CRM that look prettier and all this sort of stuff. But there's no company that has the sort of the market cap and the penetration of the market of Salesforce. So it has sort of less to do with being able to copy it versus some of these other things that exist. Like you have to figure out what is the driving value of that business, and is that something that I can take on versus the sort of software experience.
Yes, I love that you added that because we spent a good section of the time talking about that. Because, like you said, right, you can go and create that thing, but can you bring the people to it? Can you build a business around it? Can you drive revenue? Can you, do the things that are required of an actual business? This like almost gets into sort of the controversial conversation of like, do we need to start to partner our engineering degrees with business degrees, right? Is that the shift that we will maybe see? And I think it's going to be interesting.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think some of the shifts that'll happen from an engineering perspective is that the levels of abstraction will start earlier.
Sure.
So, like if you think about like going from junior engineer to maybe senior to staff to like architect or even CTO, you're sort of each level along the way you're doing bigger problems, and there's a jump in sort of the level of abstraction.
Yep.
And you might spend your first couple of years engineering doing fairly like very specific tasks, like go and like add a button to this form, solve this specific bug and stuff like that. And I think that if you start to be able to take some of that work away from using AI or make it much faster to do as an individual, then you have more time to sort of spend on these like larger, more complex problems. And that trend has been existing for a very long time. Like even when we shifted coding from like punch cards to assembly to C, there was people in each generation like shaking their fist at the next generation about how
Mhm.
like you're losing something by having this level of abstraction, and that and also that it's going to degrade the quality of the output, and all it did was essentially create more opportunity, more jobs, and more companies.
Right. Yep. Yep. I agree. Okay, so we're getting towards the end of time. We got to really tap on most of the interview questions I like to ask just naturally through conversation. Jay, thanks for the great questions. What do you do in your day to day? Maybe you're programming a little bit less. Check me on that. It might be interesting to hear about that. But when you're stuck or when you're trying to find that sort of next solution, you just feel like you just can't quite grasp exactly what that looks like. What are usually your next steps? What do you go to?
So you're talking about from like maybe from a programming standpoint, I'm stuck, not sure what to do.
Or
Um,
even just think like in your role, right? Maybe you're not writing as much code, so you can kind of check me on that. And maybe you are, right? But like generally, strategically, how do you get unstuck? Even in code, how do you get unstuck? Just sort of the listeners are usually developers here, and the precedent is like where can they go to start to get these resources that they might need?
Mhm. Yeah. So, I mean, I still code even when I was in my position of like sort of interim CMO. I was also I would find any excuse to do a little bit of side coding projects from time to time.
Hmm.
I think it's just ingrained into me. I've been doing it since I was a kid, and I think I'll always be doing that in some fashion, even if it's just for fun. But
Yep.
I think there's a couple of things that I do when I'm like stuck on a problem, and it kind of depends on the type of problem maybe I'm stuck on.
Sure.
But sometimes I think there's like the whole like rubber duck debug.
Hmm.
Like I think sometimes just like talking to somebody about it. Like even my wife is not in technology at all, but even going and kind of like explaining maybe what I'm working on and to her, a lot of times that active explanation will lead to like an insight where you're like, oh yeah, of course, like I made this mistake. And I used to be when I was in college, I did a lot of competitive programming, and
That's cool.
problem solving competitions. And there, like if sometimes if I was stuck on like a really hard problem, I would go for a walk, or sometimes if I was about to fall asleep, and you're sort of in that like partial cycle between actually asleep and awake, I would sometimes get that aha moment as well, where you're sort of just
Mhm.
passively, working on the problem. And I found that as well, just like in my career, these kind of larger scale problems. A lot of times when I allow myself to just kind of think freely, like not under the pressure of like, you need to come up with a solution right now, but just kind of walk and be thinking about stuff passively, that a lot of times can lead to those aha moments as well.
Yeah. It's really interesting because that ends up being the answer from pretty much everyone that I speak to, really. They've got some other resources they maybe throw out, but it really is like that rubber ducky, that re-explaining it and just getting away from the problem and coming back to it. And it's interesting to me, how frequently this is actually helpful, and that someone hasn't actually created some sort of a like developer community at which you just, this is where you go after you can't solve a problem and you
Mhm.
just rubber ducky. But yeah, I think it's interesting when you explain that to somebody. I do the same with my spouse. I will explain something and he doesn't have any clue what I'm talking about, but all of a sudden I'll be like, "Yes, never mind, I get it." And he's like, "Okay, great. I'm glad I could help."
Yeah. I also think sometimes that sort of trying to figure out like a new um, way to attack the problem can help as well, because maybe you're
Yeah,
just like the thing that you're trying to do, maybe you think it's the best way to do it, and you're sort of like hitting a wall with it. It's just taking a step back and thinking about from sort of first principles, like, is there another way I can approach this problem? Can help a lot as well, and that might even lead to that aha moment for the thing that you're working on, because you're able to make these connections that you weren't able to before. It was very hard when you're sort of like so deep in it and you're just like, oh, why can't I do this? And you're just like, hitting the wall over and over and over again. You need to kind of figure out like, how do I, move around the wall and take a different approach.
I agree. You kind of lose sight of the problem sometimes too when you're that deep into it, because you're frustrated, you're trying to solve it, and it's hard to actually see the light of what's all going on as well. So,
Yeah.
yeah. I love it. Okay, well, where can people find you? Jay has already sent you a LinkedIn request, but where can anyone else who is listening find you?
LinkedIn's probably the best. I'm
Okay.
on. I'm recently joined, Blue Sky and some of these things, but I'm most active on LinkedIn.
All right. I love that. Well, thank you so much for chatting with us today. Lots of amazing insights that I learned and the listeners learned. And it was just absolutely lovely having your time. So I hope you have a fabulous rest of your